My mother left me in the care of my stepfather, who subsequently expelled me from the family home 5 years later. When they sought my assistance, I informed them that I was 10 years old when my world was turned upside down, not as a result of any action on my part, but due to the unpredictable nature of life. My father had been the focal point of my life, the man who lifted me on his shoulders at football games and spent weekends teaching me how to fix a vast array of items. Then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, he was taken from me. My mother and I were left in a state of disbelief and sorrow following a car accident that resulted in my father's untimely demise. The subsequent years felt like we were trapped in a state of limbo. My mother's demeanor was desolate, her days characterized by a despondent countenance that transformed our home into a somber mausoleum, devoid of the laughter and vitality that had once defined it. I experienced a profound sense of loss, missing my mother and father equally. However, with my mother's presence, I found solace. At the age of 12, I witnessed a gradual shift in my mother's demeanor. At a teacher conference, I met Mark, who was a mathematics teacher. He was passionate about his subject, as was my mother, who was a mathematics teacher. Mark was a counselor at a different school. He had a smile that seemed to bring my mother back to life. For the first time in years, I saw a flicker of happiness in her eyes. They started dating, and it didn't take long before Mark was coming over for dinner most nights. He filled our quiet house with his booming voice and endless sports stories. At first, I tried to like him. He attempted to engage in activities that he believed would be enjoyable for me, such as throwing a football or taking me to baseball games. However, these attempts often felt forced and contrived. It seemed as though he was attempting to fulfill a checklist of activities that he believed would make him a good stepfather. A year later, right after I turned 13, I remember standing at the back of the crowd and observing my mother laughing and dancing. She seemed to be a lighter version of herself that I hadn't seen in years. This experience helped me overcome my initial doubts about the relationship. It made me realize that this could be a positive development and that we might be able to rebuild our family. However, as time passed, the facade began to disintegrate. Mark exhibited a tendency to assert his presence and influence, gradually replacing items that had been left behind by my father. His golf clubs were placed in the closet where my father's old fishing gear had been stored, and his modern art was displayed on the walls where my father's photographs of us had hung. Mark's influence extended beyond mere physical space. It permeated our routines and traditions. Our daily activities and long-held customs began to reflect his preferences. Initially, his actions were subtle, but they eventually became more pronounced. His comments included a joke about my still childish bedroom wallpaper and a remark about how a real man would start pulling his weight around the house. I was 13, trying to navigate school grief and navigate the criticism of a stranger who was evaluating every aspect of my existence. I recall one evening when I was finishing a model airplane that my father and I had started together. Mark walked in, took one look at it, and laughed. He was still playing with toys and scoffed, "Why don't you do something useful instead?" His words were a dismissal of my efforts and a critique of my identity. The gesture felt like a slap, dismissing not just what I was doing, but also my father and me. My mother observed the incident and saw the flicker of pain in her eyes, but then she masked it with a laugh. She told me that Mark was just teasing and pulled me into a side hug. She suggested that I show him the school project I was working on, as she believed he would be interested in seeing what I had accomplished. This dynamic was consistent. My mother often mediated and sought to smooth things over by asking me to take the initiative. I attempted to be the more mature and responsible individual in the situation. I changed the wallpaper, assumed additional household responsibilities, and attempted to engage Mark in discussions about his interests, including sports and cars. However, despite these efforts, the fundamental issue remained unresolved. Mark made it clear that he perceived me as an outsider, and I felt like I was experiencing a similar sense of alienation as I had when my mother was absent. She was physically present, but her support seemed conditional and selective. She would often align with Mark's perspective or dismiss my feelings, labeling me as overly sensitive or suggesting that I needed to give him a, she would say, "When you're older, you'll understand. Mark wants what's best for us." He is trying to provide for us, but his actions felt like erasing who I was and erasing my father from our lives. I spent more time in my room and more time at friends' houses, seeking a sense of normalcy and respite. When I turned 15, the situation became more challenging. I began working part-time at a local grocery store, hoping to start saving for a car or college. When Mark decided that I should start paying rent, it marked a pivotal moment in my life. He informed me of this decision during a dinner conversation, his expression stern. He advised me that if I wished to act up, I could start by contributing financially. My mother, who was present during this discussion, seemed to hesitate, but ultimately she nodded in agreement. She suggested that this arrangement might be beneficial for me and that it would teach me responsibility. As a result, half of my monthly paycheck was transferred into Mark's hands. The issue was not merely the financial aspect, it was also a matter of principle. There was a sense of being pushed into this arrangement. The day my mother informed me of her employment opportunity in Europe, I experienced a complex emotional state. On the one hand, I felt a sense of pride. On the other, I experienced a profound sense of panic. For 6 months, my mother had been excited and hopeful. I was reluctant to disrupt her positive outlook. However, I was also concerned that my living situation with Mark might intensify her feelings of despair. I confided in her about some of the behaviors I had observed from Mark, including his demeaning comments and actions. "He is merely strict," she stated, dismissing my concerns with the assertion that it would ultimately prove beneficial for both of us and that we would inevitably find a way to coexist. I was aware that there was no possibility of harmonious coexistence with someone who had not desired my presence from the outset. Nevertheless, I maintained my silence and assisted her with her packing. As we drove her to the airport, I experienced a sense of profound loss, as if I were witnessing the dissolution of my last lifeline into the clouds. The return journey was marked by silence and Mark's presence. His hand on my shoulder was not a comforting gesture. It was a stark reminder of the imminent changes to come. "Things are going to change," he said, his voice low and almost a whisper. I was acutely aware that they would not change in the way I had hoped. With my mother absent, the house felt different, colder, and emptier. Mark's presence loomed larger, and his sharp edges seemed more pronounced. I distinctly recall thinking that first night, gazing at the ceiling in my room, that the next 6 months would be challenging. Mark wasted no time establishing his new rules. The morning after Mom left, he laid them out at breakfast. It was evident that he had been preparing this list for weeks. The new rules included stricter curfews, doubled chores, and a disproportionate amount of criticism for any minor slip-up. The most troubling aspect of the new rules was that Mark decided to limit my time on the computer or phone to only an hour a day. This was because he believed that technology was making me lazy. It was evident that Mark was not just trying to exert control. He was attempting to reshape me into someone else. He sought to reshape me into someone else, someone more to his liking. Quiet, submissive, invisible. Any attempt I made to argue or explain was swiftly dismissed with a curt, "My house, my rules." One evening, I was attempting to complete my homework in the living room, where I was distracted by the noise of a football game on television. Despite my best efforts to focus on the equations in front of me, the noise was overwhelming. I requested that he turn it down, but my voice was hesitant. The request was simple and, I hoped, would be readily understood, given the multitude of books surrounding me. Instead, he turned to me with a look of annoyance, stating that this was the only time I could relax. He then informed me that his lamp had broken and that the room was too dark for me to study there. I replied in a calm and collected manner, attempting to maintain a steady voice. However, Mark scoffed and turned back to the game, stating that it was a problem that I should have been more careful about in the future. However, I was not being careless. The issue was that Mark was not allowing me to have any space of my own. I was aware that the lamp was one of the numerous items that had inexplicably ceased functioning or vanished since Mark had assumed control of the household. His passive-aggressive behavior was a clear indication that even my personal space was no longer guaranteed. As time passed, The house seemed to shrink in size, and the atmosphere became more oppressive. I spent an increasing amount of time away from home, staying late at school and spending time at the library. This was not a long-term solution, but it provided a temporary respite from the constant tension. Then came the incident with my bicycle was a source of considerable distress. I had inherited it from my father, and it represented a significant degree of personal attachment. One Saturday, I planned to meet a couple of friends at the park. I went to the shed to retrieve my bicycle, only to discover that it was no longer there. I was overcome with panic and searched frantically for it before confronting Mark, who was in the garage tinkering with his car. I demanded to know where my bicycle was. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the perspiration on my forehead. Mark did not even bother looking for it. I gave it away, stating that it was taking up space and was therefore unnecessary. I informed him that it was mine and that he could not simply dispose of it. Mark finally looked at me, his expression cold and unyielding. He stated that he had the right to dispose of it and that I needed to grow up and stop clinging to my childish things. He also informed me that it was his garage and that he was the one who decided what stayed and what went. I remember feeling so powerless and so small at that moment. The bike was not just a bike to me, it represented a connection to my father. The bicycle was one of the last tangible reminders of my late father. However, engaging in a futile argument with Mark was akin to engaging in a futile battle. He had made that distinction abundantly clear, so I chose to disengage, my fists clenched in frustration. The loss of the bicycle felt like another link to my father being severed. My friends offered their sympathies when I told them what had transpired. They attempted to console me, but the damage was already done. This situation was not merely about the bicycle. It was about every minor action Mark took to erode my presence, my past, and my identity. School became my sole source of solace. Even that was becoming challenging. My grades, which had previously been satisfactory, began to decline. My teachers noticed and inquired about the cause, but I was unable to provide a satisfactory answer. I informed them that my stepfather was a TIR and that I was experiencing distress. I remained silent and mumbled something about being tired, promising to try harder. The situation at home reached a critical point one evening over a seemingly trivial matter. Mark had decided to prepare a meal that he rarely did, expecting gratitude and praise for his efforts. The meal was satisfactory, but I was not in the mood to express gratitude. I was the grateful son, quiet, and ate without comment. This annoyed him, and he hissed, "You ungrateful little brat." He then proceeded to clear the dishes, exclaiming, "I go out of my way to make a nice dinner, and you can't even muster a thank you." I looked up, surprised by his anger over such a minor issue. I attempted to maintain composure, saying, "Thank you," but it was too late. He had already begun ranting about respect and how children these days have no appreciation for he demanded respect, his voice rising with each subsequent word. He accused me of being selfish and ungrateful, claiming that I expected the world to owe me something. The mention of my father was a particularly painful blow, evoking a strong emotional response. Despite the turmoil within, I managed to maintain a calm exterior. Mark sneered, "Why can't you handle the truth?" and began to walk away. I proceeded to my room, standing up and stating that I needed to remove myself from the situation in order to collect my thoughts. Mark then called after me, stating that I was adept at avoiding confrontation. As I walked away that night, lying in the dark of my room, I came to the realization that the situation was not going to improve in the near future. Mark had effectively turned our home into a battlefield, and I was destined to be regarded as the enemy. The following weeks were characterized by a relentless grind, with each day feeling like a marathon test of endurance. His mood swings were unpredictable. One moment he was eerily calm, and the next he was a storm of anger over the smallest things. Living with him was akin to walking through a minefield, as one never knew what would set him off. One of the new rules Mark instituted was a check-in system. I was required to text him the moment school ended, the second I left work, and right when I was on my way home. If I missed a check-in or was late by even a few minutes, there would be consequences. He asserted that the remuneration was contingent upon safety and responsibility, yet I was aware that the underlying motive was control. My position at the grocery store provided a respite from the pressures of home. My dedication was noticed by Mr. Jensen, my supervisor, who began entrusting me with greater responsibilities. He would remark, "You're a hard worker," and offer his approval. I was regarded as reliable, a quality that is increasingly rare in the modern era. While the commendation was gratifying, it also evoked a sense of melancholy, as I was aware that I was only working so much to avoid going home. On one particularly rough day, I was held up at work. A late delivery threw everything off schedule, and I missed my check-in time with Mark by 15 minutes. I realized this as I was rushing out the door, my phone buzzing with missed calls and texts. The messages were angry and full of anxiety. I called him, shaking in my hand. I asked where he was. The voice on the other end of the line was a volatile blend of rage and detachment. "I'm sorry for the delay at work. I couldn't make any excuses. You have responsibilities, Tom. You think the world stops because you're busy. You're supposed to be home an hour ago." My mind was racing with what I might expect when I arrived home. Mark was waiting in the living room. His expression was stormy. He ordered me to sit down, then proceeded to give me a lecture about respect and responsibility. He proceeded to throw out various items that he claimed I had not respected or taken responsibility for, including old photographs, a box of trinkets, a watch, and school memorabilia. I pleaded with him to stop, and in the struggle that ensued, the box fell, scattering its contents across the floor. I scrambled to pick up my belongings, while Mark towered over me. "This ends now," he growled. "I want you out of my house by tomorrow, or I'll throw you out myself." This was the final straw. I realized I could no longer tolerate the situation. Once Mark went to bed, I packed a bag with essential items and left in the middle of the night. I stayed with my best friend for a few days before finding a small room to rent with my savings from my part-time job. I did not tell my mother immediately because I did not want to burden her with the news. I was reluctant to cause her concern or jeopardize her job opportunity. I decided to wait to explain everything until she returned. I blocked Mark's number because he persistently sent threatening messages, stating that he would report me to the police if I did not return. It has been a month since then, and I have been coping on my own. It has not been easy. I am working additional hours to cover rent and basic necessities while attempting to maintain my studies. On some days, I have very little time for myself. I am currently receiving sufficient nourishment, although it is still preferable to residing in Mark's domicile. I experience feelings of culpability for departing without informing my mother, yet I also perceive that I had no alternative. The pervasive apprehension and distress were overwhelming, and I am uncertain as to the appropriateness of my actions. I am seeking guidance on whether I am in the wrong for leaving my stepfather's residence while my mother was abroad. Should I have endeavored more assiduously to maintain the situation, or should I have contacted my mother to elucidate the circumstances? I am uncertain and in need of counsel. I am grateful for your responses. I have perused the responses and am grateful for the support many of you have offered. Several of you have inquired about my current living situation and future plans. I am currently residing in a modest studio apartment that I located through a friend of a friend. While it is not an ideal situation with plumbing issues and the proximity of my neighbor's activities, it is secure and affordable. I am employed part-time at a local diner and supplement my income with online tutoring. Regarding my academic pursuits, I am currently in my senior year. I am determined to graduate. I have been in touch with my school counselor about my situation, and they have been supportive in helping me stay on track. Some of you suggested reaching out to other family members. Unfortunately, my mother was an only child, and my grandparents passed away a few years ago. My father's side of the family lost touch with us after he died. It has been just me, my mother, and Mark for the past few years. I am still unsure about how to handle things when I am torn between two conflicting impulses. On the one hand, I am eager to confide in my mother. However, on the other hand, I am apprehensive that she will not believe me or will side with Mark once again. I am uncertain about how to proceed. I will decide when the time is right. For now, I am focused on staying afloat and finishing school. I would like to thank you all again for your advice and kind words. Last week, I was apprehensive about confronting her, yet I was also eager to finally elucidate the circumstances surrounding my interactions with Mark. However, events did not unfold as I had anticipated. The day after she returned, I received a call from her. Her voice was cold and angry, a stark contrast to the warm and affectionate tone I was accustomed to. She demanded to know if it was true that I had embezzled funds from Mark and fled. I was taken aback and perplexed. My mind raced, attempting to comprehend the origin of this accusation. I attempted to explain the truth, but she was unyielding. I attempted to elucidate the circumstances surrounding Mark's verbal abuse and threats, as well as my subsequent departure from the situation for reasons pertaining to my mental health and well-being. I also recounted the incident involving the box of my belongings and Mark's daily mistreatment. However, my mother remained unresponsive to my explanations. She persisted in asserting that Mark had presented her with evidence of my misappropriation of funds. Yet when I inquired about the nature of this supposed evidence, she was evasive, citing only missing cash and suspicious bank transactions. I informed her that these claims were baseless and unfounded. I informed her that the allegations were false and that I had never stolen anything in my life. I reminded her of my consistent honesty and of my efforts to contribute to the household through my part-time employment. However, it seemed that she had already formed an opinion. I requested a face-to-face meeting, and after some persuasion, she agreed. However, when we met at a local cafe, Mark was with her. As soon as I saw him, I felt a sense of despair. He had a sorrowful expression on his face. His expression indicated distress, yet his eyes betrayed a sense of triumph. Mark feigned concern and disappointment, claiming to have provided for me while my mother was absent. However, he accused me of becoming rebellious and resorting to stealing money to fund a lavish lifestyle. He also mentioned noticing cash missing from his wallet and suspicious withdrawals from their joint account. I was utterly taken aback by his fabrication. His account of events was a fabrication, yet he presented it in a manner that was convincing. He even provided fake receipts and bank statements that he claimed proved I had been taking money. It is unclear how he fabricated them, but they appeared authentic enough to deceive my mother. He discussed how he attempted to confront me about it, but I had fled instead of facing the consequences. I attempted to defend myself by providing my side of the story. I explained how I had been working additional shifts to support myself. I had been experiencing financial difficulties in my modest accommodation. I informed him about the occasions when I had gone to bed hungry due to my inability to afford both food and rent. I implored my mother to recall my long-standing reputation for financial responsibility and to consider that I had never given her any reason to doubt me. However, Mark had been cultivating my mother's animosity for several weeks prior to her return. He had attempted to portray me as a troubled and ungrateful child who had exploited her absence to portray himself as the victim, a concerned stepfather who had only wanted to help his wayward stepson. The most distressing aspect was observing the expression of disappointment and anger on my mother's face. She stated that she was unable to fathom why I would act in such a manner towards her, having placed her trust in me while she was away. When I attempted to elucidate Mark's conduct, she accused me of attempting to deflect responsibility and fabricating falsehoods about my stepfather, who had consistently demonstrated care and support. In a state of distress, she inquired, her voice trembling, "We had provided you with everything, and in return you have offered us this." Her words were piercing, each one like a physical blow. I was at a loss as to how she could believe Mark over me, her own son. The meeting concluded with my mother stating that she needed time to consider her next steps. She made it clear that she could not have me back in the house if she could not trust me. As they departed from the cafe, I observed Mark placing his arm around my mother's shoulders comforting her. The sight made me feel sick. Over the next few days, I attempted to contact my mother on numerous occasions with the intention of persuading her to reconsider her position in light of the recent developments. However, she either ignored my calls or replied with brief, impersonal messages, admonishing me for my dishonesty and urging me to assume responsibility for my actions. I was compelled to seek alternative avenues for communication. I reached out to several of my mother's acquaintances, hoping they might be able to persuade her to reconsider her stance. However, it appeared that Mark had also influenced them. They all conveyed similar sentiments. They conveyed their disillusionment with me, expressing incredulity at my alleged penchant for thievery within my own family. Eventually, my mother sent me a comprehensive text message, stating that she had resolved that I should not return home. She informed me that she was profoundly disillusioned with me and that she required time to process the situation. She advised me not to contact her for the foreseeable future. I was profoundly distressed, not only because I had lost my home but also because I had lost my mother, the one individual I had assumed would always be on my side. I had successfully influenced her opinion, causing her to turn against her own son. The following weeks were a period of intense activity. I dedicated myself to work and school, attempting to distract myself from the absence of my family. I experienced difficulties sleeping, frequently lying awake at night, replaying conversations and questioning what I could have said differently to gain my mother's trust. My academic performance declined once more, placing me at risk of not graduating. It required the intervention of a concerned teacher to prompt me to take action. She encouraged me to seek assistance from a school counselor and a social worker, who provided resources and support. With their help, I was able to regain my academic momentum and secure additional financial aid to offset living expenses. I am currently exploring my next steps, still residing in my small apartment and maintaining my employment. I have reached out to a few trusted teachers at my school who have been supportive and are helping me navigate the process of finishing high school as an independent student. I am experiencing a range of emotions, including hurt, anger, and fear about the future. The betrayal by my mother stings deeply, and there are days when the loneliness feels overwhelming. However, I am also determined to prove Mark wrong and show my mother the truth. I am unsure if our relationship will ever be the same, but I am working towards that goal. I have not yet given up hope. For the time being, I am focusing on graduating from high school and planning for college. It will undoubtedly be challenging, but I am determined to build a better life for myself, with or without my family's support. I am grateful for the support I have received on my original post. If anyone has advice on how to move forward from here, I would be grateful to hear it. How can I heal from this betrayal? How can I build a life for myself when I feel so alone? I would appreciate any words of wisdom. I would be grateful for an update. 2 years later, it has been 5 years since my last update, and my life has changed significantly. I would like to share what has happened and seek perspective on a recent development. After high school, I devoted myself to my studies and work. The pain of losing my family was still acute, but I channeled that hurt into determination. I was awarded a scholarship to a state university, where I majored in computer science to support myself financially. I managed multiple part-time jobs simultaneously. I held various positions, including work at the university library, freelance web design, and even delivery of pizzas on weekends. College presented a challenging yet liberating experience, the first of its kind in years. I was finally free from the constant fear and anxiety that had plagued me while living with Mark. I formed close friendships and even began seeing a therapist to work through the trauma of my past. I graduated with honors and was subsequently offered a position at a promising tech startup. The work was demanding, with long hours and high pressure, but I flourished in the face of adversity, basking in the appreciation bestowed upon me for my abilities and work ethic. It had been a considerable duration since I had experienced such esteem. Over the past 3 years, I have ascended the ranks of the company, initially commencing as a junior developer. My unwavering dedication and ingenious concepts soon captured the attention of the upper echelons, leading to my promotion to a team lead within a year. Most recently, I have been appointed as the lead developer for our primary product. Our startup has recently secured a substantial investment, propelling us into the upper echelons of the tech industry. As a result of my professional achievements, I received a considerable salary increase and stock options with the potential for significant financial gain, contingent upon the company's continued growth. This was the first time in my life that I had achieved financial stability and a sense of comfort. I purchased my first vehicle, relocated to a more comfortable apartment, and even began saving for the future. Throughout this period, I maintained minimal contact with my mother and father. It was challenging, particularly during holidays and significant life events like my college graduation and job promotions. There were occasions when I found myself awake at night, pondering whether my mother ever considered me, whether she regretted placing her trust in Mark over me. However, I was determined to forge a new life for myself and to establish a support system of close friends and mentors. Last week, I received a call from a number I had not seen in years. When I answered, there was a brief pause, and then I heard a voice I had not heard in 5 years. It was my mother. Her voice sounded tired and my mother sounded desperate, unlike the confident, loving mother I remembered from my childhood. She informed me that she and Mark were experiencing financial difficulties. Apparently, Mark had made some poor investment decisions, resulting in their facing foreclosure on their house. The company Mark worked for had gone bankrupt, leaving him unemployed for the past year. They had depleted their savings and were now drowning in debt. My mother apologized for everything that had transpired years ago. Her voice trembled as she admitted that she had come to realize over time that Mark had been manipulating her. She stated that she regretted not believing me and that the guilt had been a persistent source of distress for years. She inquired if we could meet to discuss the matter and attempt to repair our relationship. I was taken aback, as I had envisioned this moment. My mother recognizing the truth, reaching out to reconnect. However, now that it was occurring, I experienced a tumult of emotions, including hope, anger, sadness, and a persistent sense of betrayal. After a prolonged pause, I consented to meet her at a cafe, the same one where the confrontation occurred 5 years ago. Upon my arrival, I was surprised to see both my mother and Mark present. My mother appeared older and more worn down, with her hair thinner and her face lined with worry. Mark seemed to have lost the arrogant demeanor he once exhibited, with his shoulders slumped and his eyes downcast. They proceeded to provide a detailed account of their situation. They were months behind on their mortgage payments, and the bank was threatening to foreclose on their property. Mark had lost his job when his company folded, and despite his efforts, he had been unable to secure alternative employment. Since my mother's salary as a teacher was insufficient to cover their debts and living expenses, Mark had been unable to maintain his previous lifestyle. As they spoke, I observed a shift in the dynamic between them. My mother appeared more assertive, frequently interrupting Mark or offering corrections. In contrast, Mark seemed subdued, a stark contrast to his previous demeanor. The real reason for their visit soon became apparent. They requested financial assistance to help them regain their financial stability. They had heard through mutual acquaintances about my success in the tech industry and believed I might be in a position to provide assistance. I listened to their appeal, experiencing a complex array of emotions. One part of me felt vindicated, as they were finally acknowledging that Mark had lied and manipulated the situation years ago. However, another part of me was frustrated that they only sought help when they needed it. My mother reached across the table and took my hand.